forgiveness. Is our talk title today? Or let go and get dragged. My sister gave me that saying years ago, let go or get dragged. And I just had this image of, hands clutched to the bumper. And it runs down the highway. Wait, you were supposed to be my good! We hold on to something that's hurting us and hurting us and hurting us. And it's like, oh, the human condition. Oh, the human condition. In Scripture, in Matthew, Jesus is quoted as saying, forgive your brother 70 times 7. Right? It's Matthew 18:22. And that's a great way of understanding for me. It's like, oh my God, the process of forgiveness needs to be done over and over again. It's not a one-time thing. It's true what you say. All that matters now is what's in my heart, right, today. But tomorrow, I need to make sure that what's in my heart is serving me as well. All that matters now. And so I think there's a great demonstration of that in our world right now. I mean, I feel I've forgiven him 70 times. 70 times 7 even. And for those of you who are of another persuasion, there's emails to forgive and other things to forgive. And how do we live in this world? How do we talk about what we value, and how do we promote what we value, and live in this place where we don't get dragged down the road? Where we don't get dragged down the street, hurt, but clinging to what we think is right, clinging to what we think should happen. And as I was thinking about this concept again, circling back through forgiveness, I was watching and listening to some of the teachings of Fred Luskin, who we've had come speak here before. Fred ran the Forgiveness Project at Stanford. He's a professor at Stanford and has studied forgiveness. One of the things he talks about is that actually forgiving, the act of forgiveness, is a choice for peace. That in that moment when we forgive, we're making the choice to choose peace rather than the pain and the turmoil that's been going on. So to forgive is to choose peace rather than torment and struggle. He goes on in that talk to say there's a second component. That's a very clear and simple way to understand forgiveness. But he goes on to say that in his research shows that the second component of forgiveness is to realize that you have caused the distress. You have caused the distress. And that seems the antithesis of, no, that person out there caused my distress, right? But we know in unity that there is nothing outside that can disturb the peace of our mind unless we let it. Right? And he has a really interesting and profound statement about this. It's like something happened in your life. Something happened that is life itself that you find untenable. You find shouldn't have happened. And you're thinking that that person shouldn't have done that this event shouldn't have occurred, or I shouldn't have had to go through this, is the cause of your pain, of your turmoil, and your lack of peace. And that actually, when you let go of your belief, your thought, your idea about that other person, is when peace comes back. Your forgiving is choosing peace. But what you're doing is letting go of that it shouldn't have happened. That it shouldn't be this way. That it shouldn't cause me this pain. When you accept the radical acceptance of what is, as Byron Katie would say. Right? It should have happened because it did happen. It was supposed to happen because it did. And we can all see that in many different ways when we think back in our own lives. I invite you in this moment to think back in your own life. To think of a diagnosis or a situation in your own life or in a loved one's life that you wish hadn't happened. But can you also think back and know and examine all the things that happened because of it? That when we can accept it, when we can embrace it even, peace happens, transformation happens, untold goodness happens. Desmond Tutu wrote a book, and I've shared it here from platform before, but I revisited it again a couple years later, and I'm looking at it again. It's called The Book of Forgiving. And he outlined the steps of forgiving very simply. He had 4 different steps of forgiving. The first is to tell the story. That you need to find a safe place and a willing participant to tell your story to tell the story of what happened, that you get to be seen and understood and heard and respected for your story. Now, this is a double-edged sword, as we know, because we all have friends, because it's never us, right? We all have friends who tell the same story over and over and over again. Oh my God, I've heard this story for 20 years. Right? That never happens by us. It's always just our friends who do that. But if they can only come to unity, they really get it, and they'd stop doing that. So, tell your story. But tell it with awareness. Tell it with awareness. Hear the words you're saying. Hear the story you're telling. And own it. Own what happened. We're not in psychological denial that these things don't occur in our lives, that there are tragedies in the world, that there are misfortunes that befall people. Tell the story. Explain it. Be witnessed, be seen, be bold. Tell your story. And see, listen, and see where you are in consciousness. Telling your story, if you listen as you're telling it, allows you to notice what's shifting in your life. To notice, even if you're telling the same story that you've told before, are you different in it? Is the story different? Is there grace and compassion in it this time? Or are you still in victim mode? Are you the victim of the story, or are you the narrator of the story? There's a huge difference, right? And just be aware of where you're sitting in that. The second step in is name the hurt. Now, he specifically says name the hurt. And I want you to understand this. As I was struggling with this, I wrestled with name the hurt, because that's not a unity principle. We don't affirm the hurt. We don't affirm the pain, right? But it's really important in forgiving to identify what it is that we want to be healed, what we want peace around. And until we're specific enough to name the hurt, we can't make a shift. So I thought about this today, and it was really interesting. Naming the hurt allows us to take this general aggravation. You ever gone through a day where it just seems things get under your skin really easily and you don't know why, or people get under your skin easily and you don't know why? Naming the hurt allows you to call into what you want. Naming the hurt in a situation allows you to be really clear about your values and your needs, to be able to identify your needs in the moment. And the way it came up for me this week is I had several different interactions where I was feeling, how did I put it? I feel like, oh my God, this was a setup, right? Victim. This was a setup. I walked into this, and when I went to tell the story, it wasn't identifiable. I didn't understand what it was. I wasn't making the other person wrong. I was trying to just identify the steps along the way and how I played into it. And I was aware, but it still was like, when I went to naming the hurt, when I had to name the hurt, it was, I didn't feel heard. I didn't feel respected. And it's like, oh, naming the hurt allowed me to say, oh, I need for some reciprocity here. I need for some understanding and some willingness to meet me halfway. I value self-awareness, and I value willingness to examine relationships. So the hurt was, for me, that it was not a dialogue. The hurt for me was that I was marginalized, set aside. And that made me react in ways that I didn't find attractive. I found myself, it didn't make me do anything. Good catch. I found myself reacting rather than responding. Right? Reacting rather than responding. So the process of telling the story and naming the hurt helped me understand that it's the little things. It is actually the little things, and from the people closest to you, that you need the most help in forgiving. And interestingly, I was reading, Adam Grant is a social scientist at Wharton Business School, and reading one of his books right now. It was fascinating. He talked about finding allies and finding how to work together in the world. And his studies show that actually groups that are mostly aligned but vary on some certain ideals, fight more, have more conflict and more hostility towards each other than people on the polar opposite spectrums of life, right? So in his studies, he studied Orthodox Jews and conservative Jews. And the Orthodox Jews found that the people who were conservative Jews were just not doing it right. And they had more animosity and more, when they measured what they thought about each other, more hatred for the people in the conservative camp than they did for progressives and liberals in Judaism, right? And then he studied, excuse me, I'm blanking on it, but he studied also, I'll take a deep breath. Oh, yes, this one was fascinating. Vegans and vegetarians. Vegans thought vegetarians were wannabes and fakes. If you're going to do it, just do it. Otherwise, just eat meat. Right? That was the camp. And look at our politics. Right? Look at our politics. If we're in one camp or the other, there's this idea that somehow the people who are in our tent, but not quite as far left or right as we are actually thwarting our good. If they would only get on board with this, if they only do what was best, then we could all survive. And that's true across all spectrums, right? We have more problems, actually, in some levels, with people who share our faith, but have some slight deviations from it. We have more fights with how unity is supposed to be in unity than we do with other faiths. Because if I took a poll, everyone would say all these wonderful things about Islam right now, because it's really nice to be in support of Islam right now because they're under siege. Right? In our society, it feels like they're under siege anyway. And yet, we save most of our venom for those who are actually closer to our way of thinking. And it's an interesting psychological behavior that we participate in. So telling the story and naming the hurt, I find, allows you to examine it closely and to step out of that kind of consciousness that calls your allies your enemies. Right? And to understand that alliances can be made and relationships healed across a broad spectrum. Sometimes easier to forgive the stranger than the person sitting next to you. So in that moment, the next step is to grant forgiveness. Just to choose to do it. To do it over and over again, the 70 times 7. To grant forgiveness for the perceived wrong. To grant forgiveness to yourself for holding that grudge for so long. Or for not doing it right. Or playing the victim. Grant forgiveness to yourself for falling short. I set really high goals some days. Some days I wake up and set my intention very high. And I fall short. I fall short of that most days. But I set the intention, and I just caution us all not to use goal setting or desire to live from our divinity, as we would say here, as an excuse to blame ourselves when we don't. We are all doing the best we can at any given moment. And when I can know that about myself, I can also know it about you. So hard some days to grant forgiveness. But it frees us. Right? I choose to grant forgiveness so that I'm set free from you. I'm set free from my expectations of you. I'm set free from my expectations of myself. I choose to grant forgiveness to free myself from pain. Desmond Tutu in this book talks about people coming in front of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa and talked about rape and murder and situations that I personally can't even imagine living in. And yet these people, after they told their story, grant forgiveness. Grant forgiveness in the moment. And then what he offers and what I offer to you too is in that moment to understand that you choose to renew or release the relationship. And here's the key that I never understood or never heard in any other forgiveness talk. Forgiving you is an act of strength. Forgiving myself is an act of real strength. Forgiving anyone is an act of strength. Only the strong can do it. Because it's not granting pardon. It's not saying it never happened. It's saying, yes, it happened, and I choose to forgive in this moment. I choose to let it go, to release it, so I don't get dragged down the road. And so that you're free. So that we can all be free. And in that moment, you get to choose to renew or release the relationship. Now, If you choose to renew the relationship, it doesn't mean that we go back to the same old way. It can't be the same old way. I've told this story. I gained the awareness. I have stated what it is I value and want in life. I've been changed by the process, so the relationship will have to be changed as well. But to enter into that relationship again, anew, from a different spot, is empowering, is healing, and allows that other person or that other situation to have the same chance we'd all want. The same chance we'd all want to start over again. Or I choose to release the relationship and move on. Now, that doesn't mean it may not come back in another form, as we all know. How many of us have married the same person over and over again? I have the same friend over and over and over again, right? But we, with awareness, can work on those situations, can work in that situation, right? To renew or release the relationship is a powerful choice. And the sayings, once again, of Jesus, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. This is from Luke. And supposedly it's when he's being nailed to the cross. Right? It only appears in Luke. So scholars have lots of debates about, did this really happen? Is it the writer? Is it written 100 years after? What's the story? But I love the idea, even if you take out the Father, that external God, and just say, forgive them, when they know not what they do. To yourself, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Forgive me. I forgive me. Because I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know the effect of my words, my thoughts, my behaviors until I am. I don't know until I am. Father, higher self, Spirit, forgive me, for I know not what I do. I've told you this story before, but I'm going to finish with it. Again, because I think it illustrates the importance and the immediacy of forgiveness. A couple years ago, when I was still in school, I went home to visit my mother to New Orleans. And my brother-in-law's mother was in hospice. My brother-in-law and I went to school together. My sister met him through me. They got married. He's been in my life for decades and decades. And his mom was sick. She was never an easy woman to get along with. She was out at family functions all the time. But she was sick, and she was in hospice. She was down to 80 pounds. And I went to visit her. When I walked in, she was crying. Just crying. She wasn't drinking or eating anymore, but there was this river of tears rolling down her cheeks. And she just kept saying, I'm worried about all the wrong things. I'm worried about all the wrong things. None of it mattered. None of it mattered. And my brother-in-law wasn't there yet. He was driving in. And she said to me, make sure Keith knows that how amazing he was. How amazing he is. And that all the stuff I'm worried about is unimportant. And we all, I hope that you all get to be with someone at that moment of transition when they understand what's really important. When I got back home, I was sitting and all that, and my mom said, yeah, they're doing it all wrong. They're doing it all wrong. She sat there at the table said, they're not talking about what's important. They're doing it all wrong. And I said, well, Mom, what would you want to say if that were you laying on the And she looked at me and she said, I want my kids to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry I made all those mistakes, but I didn't know any better. I didn't know what I was doing, and I just did the best I could, and I want them to know I'm sorry. I looked at her and told her, I know. I love you. I know you did the best you could, and we're fine. We're good. Mom has early stages of Alzheimer's, and she doesn't remember that conversation anymore. I asked her about it recently. She said, I have no recollection of that. But I do. I do. I know I'm good with my mom. I know I have forgiven 70 times 7. And that there's nothing I need to say or do to heal that. That gift of forgiveness frees me to love her and take care of her every moment of the day. So whether those persons are here on the planet still, or making their transition, or have made their transition, that healing work, forgive, and move on. Let's take that to our time for meditation.